With a whopping 16 albums under their belts, Enslaved continues their relentless onslaught of uncompromising creative direction and experimentation within the genres of extreme and black metal. And while there is much to say and love about Heimdal, what really strikes me on just the first few listens is how Enslaved has seemingly mastered the art of contrast. Contrast in the case of Enslaved's Heimdal meaning taking wildly different musical elements and smashing them together and still creating something beautifully coherent in the process and even making sparks fly. In many ways, through this masterclass in contrast, Enslaved continues to approach heavy metal not just as the brute force cathartic music style that we all love it to be, but also as a valid form of artistic expression through the studio recording process born out of a true passion for their craft. Let's dive in. Now, as with most of Enslaved's output, Heimdal is a concept album which pokes and prods at the veil of mystery surrounding the Norse god of the same name. And while Heimdal may be one of the more familiar gods, thanks to Marvel, familiar Norse gods, thanks to Marvel, in truth, we know very little about the details around him, especially compared to others like Odin or Thor. And if you poke around what we do know, you really only come across some pretty weird and cryptic stuff that doesn't actually leave you with that many answers and leaves you with more questions. So in this way, the song Behind the Mirror is an excellent opening track for such a concept album, as it addresses the very confusing relationship between Heimdal and Odin. Most notably is that one might be the son of the other, but the who's who is never quite cleared up. And even further, it's in this myth that we find the confusing implication that Odin may not even be a person, but rather a persona or a state of mind. Keep in mind, we're talking about the actual source material of the myths, not Snorri Sturluson's version from the Middle Ages that sort of restructures a lot of Norse myth into biblical terms. Now, the music of Behind the Mirror opens up the album with a really juicy, heavy riff that eventually leads into a dance between the two guitars and a really trippy bridge towards the end. And this might be a bit of a stretch, but considering the core concept of this song is the relationship, the weird and nebulous relationship between Heimdal and Odin, I see that bridge as reflecting that core theme of this song. It might be a bit of a stretch, but I really appreciate it when music reflects the actual lyrics and the topic of a song, so I'm going to just take it as my interpretation. Now, as will be a theme throughout both the album and this album review, the chorus of the song plays Gruddel's... I've never said that name out loud before. I'm gonna go with Grudel. It plays Gruddel's signature growls in duet with Håkon Vinja's stunning clean vocals. We'll return to this as we go through more tracks, and I'll say more about why it's significant to me. Now, next up, Congelia shows Enslaved at their most Pink Floyd, revealing just how much songwriter Ivar Bjornsson digs 70s prog and loves to play around with it. Now, after Congelia comes perhaps the strongest track on the album, Forest Dweller, which we're all familiar with as it was like the single leading up to the album. There's just so much to love about Forest Dweller. The songwriting and the orchestration is stellar, killer keyboard and acoustic guitar work, and yet again, the clean and growled vocals are pitted against each other after a brute force transition from the quieter verse into the more heavy, brutal chorus. Again, more contrast there. Now, from this track on, I feel like the album really becomes consistently driven by vocals, and you get a pretty consistent run of also some pretty banging riffs to the end of the album. Kingdom has one of the more interesting riffs on the album that opens it up with the hi-hat going crazy. I love that sort of Enslaved riff. While Eternal Sea finally gives the bass a spotlight, finally, representation. And with yet again, after that bass intro, the clean and growled vocals work together to create a pretty unique sound palette. I have to mention at this point in the album that this is also some of the most interesting keyboard work Enslaved has done, and the synth player is really daring and even unapologetic with trying out different sounds and patches to play against the guitars. Not often that I enjoy synths in my heavy metal, I'm one of those people, but this is a pretty notable exception for me. And now moving along, we're all familiar with Caravans to the Outer Worlds at this point, thanks to the band's last EP during COVID, where there's even more bass, yes, that leads into probably the most classically metal song on the whole album. If my memory serves me correctly, this is the first track that actually had me like bobbing my head along with it. Now, be it pitting the clean vocals against the growls, the acoustic ambient verses against the brutal driving choruses, the competing keyboards with the guitars, or even the transition from the meandering congelia into the focused and driving forest dweller, Enslaved's Heimdal is a masterclass in not just any contrast, but coherent contrast. Anyone can take opposite musical elements and smash them together and say, hey, look, it's contrast. But it takes a very special talent to take such competing musical elements and put them together in a way that makes sense and creates a coherent work of art. And that is exactly what Enslaved has done here with Heimdal, and keep the listening experience dynamic and different every time through. I've listened to the album about a half a dozen times so far, and I do have to say that every time I've listened to it, I've picked up on something different, and that's sort of the beauty of having so much contrast in an album, is depending on whatever mood the listener is, whatever mood you're in, you'll pick up on different things and appreciate different musical elements. To wrap it up, I guess, Enslaved's Heimdal is a true work of studio art, and it shows what happens when a band of veterans show a true passion for their craft. Heimdal is a truly captivating and enchanting album that I can confidently label as one of the band's best in recent years. It's got everything to love about Enslaved and more, and I am looking forward to seeing them in Denver next month. What's your favorite track on the album? Mine is a toss-up between Forest Dweller and Eternal Sea, but with all the variation on this album, I'll bet every song is someone's favorite. So guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to share, like, subscribe if you like the review, check out the Patreon too, and I'll see you all next time on the Nordic Sound channel.